Harlem, 1955, the winter wind whipped down 7th Avenue, carrying with it the grit of a neighborhood weary from years of neglect. In a drafty tenement apartment on Sugar Hill, a 73-year-old woman known in the community as Mama Willie May Johnson pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her shoulders. She had lived in that Harlem apartment for over a decade, paying her rent on time every month. The building at 409 Edgecombe Avenue had once been one of Harlem's most prestigious addresses, home to black luminaries like W.E.B., Du Bois, and Thurgood Marshall in its heyday, but by the 1950s it, like much of Harlem, had fallen into disrepair. Paint peeled from the walls, radiators clanked impotently without giving heat, and rats scuttled in the walls. Willie May, proud and soft-spoken, had endured these indignities quietly for years. She worked long hours as a cleaning woman, double shifts at times, and never missed a rent payment. But this winter, something in her had finally broken. The heat had failed yet again during a frigid cold snap, and her repeated pleas to the landlord for basic repairs had been ignored. In protest, Willie May withheld that month's rent, a small act of defiance that she hoped would force the landlord to fix the boiler and patch the gaping holes in the walls where vermin crept through. She had no way of knowing that this single act would set in motion a chain of events that would soon rock Harlem and burnish the legend of her son, Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson, in ways no one could have imagined. Outside on the street, neighbors huddled on stoops to swap the latest news. Harlem in the mid-1950s felt like a powder keg of frustration and hope. The neighborhood that had once been the vibrant capital of Black America was now a slum, by official accounts, ravaged by redlining, neglect, and the tail end of Robert Moses's slum clearance projects that displaced thousands of black families. Many who had the means had already fled to newer housing in other boroughs or suburbs, while those left behind struggled in overcrowded, aging tenements owned by absentee landlords. Segregation in housing was still an oppressive reality. Black New Yorkers were largely confined to specific ghetto districts like Harlem, their housing options limited by discrimination. As far back as the 1920s, activists had noted how this segregation made black tenants the special prey of greedy rent gougers, forced to pay exorbitant rents for dilapidated, unsanitary quarters because they had nowhere else to go. 30 years later, little had changed. By 1955, Harlem's black residents were still largely penned into the ghetto and charged outrageous rents for apartments with leaky roofs, faulty plumbing, and no heat in winter. City agencies turned a blind eye to housing code violations above 110th Street. Slumlords grew rich while their tenants shivered and children coughed in unheated rooms. Willie May Johnson's landlord was one such figure. In Harlem, he was known derisively as Mr. Green, a sardonic nod to the color of his greed. His real name was Samuel Greenfield, a white property owner who held deeds to several Harlem buildings, yet seldom set foot in the neighborhood except to collect rent. Greenfield saw Harlem's tenants not as human beings, but as sources of income. He had a reputation for squeezing every dime he could. Repairs cost money, he often told his superintendents, so don't go fixing anything unless the city forces it. In practice, that meant roofs went unrepaired, letting water leak down walls, boilers stayed broken for weeks in the depths of winter, and rats bred freely in garbage choked air shafts. Tenants who dared complain found themselves threatened with eviction or intimidation. It was an old strategy among slumlords, make conditions so intolerable that tenants would give up and move out on their own or withhold rent, so you'd have an excuse to evict them. In fact, at that very moment in Harlem, a notorious developer named Robert Olnick was doing exactly this to clear out land for a new luxury complex his tenants complained of rat infestations, falling plaster, faulty wiring, and no heat in winter. Conditions they believed Olnick imposed deliberately to drive them away. For landlords like Greenfield, cruelty was just a tactic to maintain control and profits. On this gray January morning, Willie May became one more victim of that cruelty. A loud pounding on her door at 8 a.m. startled her awake. On the other side stood Greenfield's building manager, a burly man in a cheap overcoat flanked by 2 NYPD officers. Willie May's neighbors began to gather in the drafty hallway as the commotion grew. "Open up, Mrs. Johnson." The manager barked. Through the thin wood of the door, his tone was impatient, edged with mean glee. Willie May, heart-pounding, opened the door a crack. Before she could speak, the manager shoved an official paper at her. Eviction notice. Her rent withholding, however well-intentioned, had given Greenfield the pretext he needed. The manager's voice echoed in the corridor. You didn't pay, so you're out. Got 10 minutes to grab your things. A gasp went up from the neighbors who'd assembled, many of them elderly ladies and working folks who knew Willie May as a quiet, kind presence. She had lived there 12 years without incident. How could they throw her out like this? A few neighbors immediately protested, their voices rising in indignation. One middle-aged man stepped forward, his fist balled. "Have you no shame? She's an old woman!" You can't put her on the street in the dead of winter. The police officers fixed stony glares on the crowd, and one rested a hand on his nightstick. The building manager sneered. "This ain't your concern," he snapped at the onlookers. "Anyone interferes, and you'll be arrested too." In 1955, there was no right to a court hearing before eviction for tenants like Willie May. A landlord could legally oust a tenant swiftly for non-payment. And in a city where black tenants had little political clout, the police were often all too eager to back up a landlord over a black renter. Within minutes, the worst happened. Willie May's few pieces of furniture were hauled out by the manager and a couple of rough-handed superintendents he'd recruited. A fragile end table, an overstuffed armchair covered in crocheted doilies, a battered iron bed frame, all were dragged into the hallway and heaped near the stairwell landing. One of the superintendents carelessly knocked a framed photograph off the wall. The glass shattered, and the sound of breaking glass echoed through the Harlem tenement like a bell of doom. Willie May stood in her doorway in shock, tears brimming in her eyes, but pride keeping them from falling. She clutched a small cardboard suitcase, into which she'd hurriedly gathered a few clothes, and on her arm hung a canvas bag containing her Bible and the important papers she always kept safe. Neighbors stared in horror and anger. Some began muttering about Bumpy Johnson, realizing whose mother, Sue or mother, figure was being treated so disgracefully. A young man named Raymond, who lived downstairs, rushed up to help. He gently took Willie May's elbow. "Mama Johnson, you come stay at our place," he urged softly. His wife was already clearing space in their living room. Others nodded. If the law wouldn't protect this elderly woman, the community would have to. Down on the street, a crowd was forming as news spread along the block. Furniture and personal belongings were now being dumped on the curb. An icy drizzle had begun to fall, flecking the sidewalks with dirty snow. From across the street, folks watched as an NYPD patrol wagon idled, the police clearly anticipating trouble. Among the onlookers was an off-duty postal worker who shook his head and said, "They doing this to Bumpy's moms. That landlord's got a death wish." The name Bumpy rippled through the gathering throng in hushed tones, equal parts hope and apprehension. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. Everyone in Harlem knew that name. Some spoke it with reverence, the Harlem crime boss who had once put white gangsters in their place and passed out turkeys on Thanksgiving to poor neighbors. Others whispered it with fear, the ruthless racketeer who ran the numbers racket and wasn't shy about using violence. Most, however, felt a complicated respect for Bumpy Johnson. He was a criminal, yes, but he was their criminal, a black man who had risen in a world dominated by white mobsters, a man who, owls in the eyes of many Harlemites, protected the community even as he profited from it. He had stood up to the infamous Dutch Schultz in the 1930s, defending Harlem's economic autonomy during the Bloody Numbers War. That left over 40 people dead. He had become the de facto godfather of Harlem, cultivating friendships with luminaries like singer Billie Holiday and boxer Sugar Ray Robinson, and donating generously to local families in need. Older folks recalled how Bumpy would pay neighbors rent to save them from eviction when he could, a Robin Hood figure with a streak of menace. And now here was his own mother, so they believed being evicted like a common stranger. The injustice hung in the air, tangible and electric. Unbeknownst to many on that street, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson was not even physically in New York at this time. He was 600 miles away in Mateneau, Loveland 17, in Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary on an island in San Francisco Bay. In 1952, Bumpy had been convicted on a federal narcotics conspiracy charge and handed a 15-year sentence. After losing his appeals, he'd arrived at Alcatraz in 1954, joining the ranks of the country's most notorious prisoners. By 1955, he was in his early 50s, sitting in a cell as far from Harlem as one could imagine, but his influence in Harlem had not entirely disappeared. Even behind bars, Bumpy remained a presence to be reckoned with. He corresponded regularly with his wife, Mamie, and with key members of his organization. It was said on the streets that Bumpy's ears were everywhere. If something important happened in Harlem, word would find its way to him in Alcatraz, whether through coded letters, messages passed via visiting friends, or the network of prison contacts he'd cultivated. The federal authorities knew he was a big fish. They monitored his mail and visits, yet somehow news from Harlem still filtered through, and nothing would qualify as more important to Bumpy than the well-being of his family. Back on Edgecombe Avenue, the eviction drama reached its painful conclusion. Mama Willie May, a proud woman who had survived the Jim Crow South and the Great Migration North, stood trembling on the sidewalk next to a small pile of her possessions. A few porcelain dishes, a case of clothes, the cracked picture frame with her only photo of Bumpy, taken years ago at his wedding to May. She held that photo now, shards of glass falling away as she tried to wipe it clean with shaking fingers. Her neighbors formed a protective circle around her, their faces etched with outrage and pity. Some were openly weeping at the sight of this dignified grandmother figure cast out into the cold. A New York-Amsterdam news reporter happened to be passing by and paused to scribble in his notebook. Scenes like this were sadly common, and the black press often covered such evictions to highlight the ongoing housing crisis. Indeed, the plight of black tenants facing eviction had even entered popular culture. Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel Invisible Man includes a wrenching scene of an elderly black couple's eviction in Harlem, and in a few years Lorraine Hansberry's Broadway play A Raisin in the Sun would center on a black family's desperate struggle to secure decent housing. Harlem's reality was literature's inspiration. Now life was imitating art on Edgecombe Avenue, and those watching understood they were witnessing yet another chapter of the community's pain, and perhaps, if fate allowed, its resilience. One of the bystanders, Miss Thelma Jackson, a matriarch from the block, stepped up and draped a wool shawl around Willie May's shoulders. "Don't you worry, baby," Ms. Jackson said, her voice loud enough for the landlord's men to hear. "We're going to take care of you. Harlem takes care of its own." This was spoken as much to comfort Willie May as to warn any who thought this eviction would be the end of the story. Harlem, for all its troubles, still had a communal heart. In the 1930s, tenant organizers and neighbors had literally fought police to resist evictions, carrying furniture back into apartments as fast as marshals could throw it out. Those days of militant, eviction resistance had waned by the 1950s, but the spirit had not vanished. If the law couldn't able or wouldn't protect an elderly black woman, maybe someone outside the law would. A name was on everyone's lips now, barely whispered. Bumpy, if only Bumpy were here. It was as much a prayer as a statement. They all knew Bumpy Johnson was locked up. They also knew that prison bars had never fully contained his reach. And sure enough, even as Willie May was escorted to a kindly neighbor's apartment for shelter, the grapevine had sprung into action. A young man took off at a sprint to a payphone to call one of Bumpy's old lieutenants. A shopkeeper who had a cousin working in the federal prison system vowed to get a message to the big man in Alcatraz. Within hours, news of the eviction hit the underworld telegraph. Bumpy's mother's been thrown out into the street. By nightfall that day, nearly every hustler, numbers runner, and street corner deacon in Harlem knew what had happened. People shook their heads in taverns and barbershops. That white landlord must be crazy. An undercurrent of anticipation and fear coursed through the community. Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson's backstory was legendary, and it hung over what was happening now like a portent. Bumpy had come to Harlem as a teenager in 1919, sent north by parents fearful his bold defiance of Southern racism would get him lynched in South Carolina. He earned his nickname, Bumpy, from a prominent bump on his head, but many joked it was also fitting for the bumpy road his life would take. By the 1930s, Bumpy Johnson was a force on the Harlem streets, a protégé of the famed numbers Queen Madame Stephanie St. Clair and the chief enforcer in the war against Dutch Schultz, a white mobster who tried to invade Harlem's lucrative numbers rackets. That war was brutal, more than 40 people killed in tit for tat violence, but in the end Dutch Schultz was himself assassinated, by Lucky Luciano's order, not Bumpy's, though Harlem lore sometimes gave Bumpy credit. In the power shuffle after Schultz's 1935 death, Bumpy brokered a deal with Luciano's Italian mafia. The Italians would stay out of the numbers game and partner with Bumpy in other ventures, effectively making him the uncontested African-American crime boss in Harlem. For the next 15 years, until his 1951 indictment, Bumpy Johnson reigned in Harlem's underworld. He was a dapper figure in tailored suits, holding court at spots like Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue. And despite or perhaps because of his criminal enterprises, he cultivated an image as a protector of Harlem. He paid people's medical bills, bailed out young men who got into scrapes, and yes, he was known to quietly cover a month's rent for families facing eviction. Despite his tough exterior, Bumpy was extremely generous and philanthropic in Harlem, one contemporary later recalled. He also had no tolerance for disrespect, especially when it came to his family. Those who knew Bumpy's personal life recalled that he was fiercely devoted to the women who raised and supported him. His elder sister Mabel, who took him in when he first came to Harlem, and his grandmother back in Charleston, these were sacred figures to him. And above all, there was his mother, Margaret. Though she never left South Carolina, Bumpy remained a dutiful son, sending money home regularly and even visiting under assumed names before the war. In Harlem, he found a surrogate mother figure in an older woman. Some say she was a distant relative or a close family friend whom he affectionately called Mama Willie May. It was Willie May whom the community recognized as Bumpy's mother in Harlem. Even though she was not his biological mom, she was the one who sat in the front pew beaming with pride when Bumpy married Mamie Hatcher in 1948. She cooked Sunday dinners for Bumpy's crew sometimes, fussing over them as a mother would, and they in turn treated her with the utmost respect. If ever there was a person Bumpy Johnson would not abide being harmed, it was this gentle, church-going woman who had his love and the honorary title of Mama. Thus, the outrage on the street was not simply because an elderly lady had been mistreated. It was because this elderly lady was Bumpy's lady, and anyone who knew Bumpy's history knew that crossing that line could be fatal. Night fell on Harlem, cold and moonless. In a small apartment on 145th Street, where Willie May was given a temporary bed, a cluster of Bumpy's closest Harlem associates gathered to decide what to do. At the kitchen table sat Nat Pettigrew, Bumpy's best friend and right-hand man. Pettigrew was a tough, barrel-chested man who had been Bumpy's lieutenant in the narcotics operation and one of the few people Bumpy trusted with his life. Also present was Calvin Junie Bird, a younger protégé who handled day-to-day numbers banking while Bumpy was away. And Miss Mamie Johnson herself, Bumpy's wife, had arrived, having rushed up from their home, her face etched with worry. Mamie took Willie May's hands in hers, gently consoling the older woman. But when Mamie looked up at Pettigrew, her usually warm eyes were steely. "Net," she said in a low voice, "we have to tell him." Right away. Pettigrew nodded. He had already sent a telegram earlier that afternoon to the warden at Alcatraz, a pre-arranged ruse they'd used before to get urgent news to Bumpy. The telegram read simply, AUNTCICK, VRILNEEEADVCE. Nay, it was a coded message, and referred to a family figure, Willie May, very ill, was their code for a serious situation. Need advice, signaled that Bumpy should call home at the first opportunity. This was a dangerous gambit. Inmates at Alcatraz couldn't exactly place phone calls at will, but Bumpy had ways. He was in good standing at the prison despite a few minor dust-ups early on, and had earned the guards' begrudging respect for his calm demeanor and, ironically, his leadership qualities among the black inmates. If Bumpy urgently needed to call his wife due to a family emergency, the warden might allow a supervised call. Pettigrew was counting on that. Sure enough, around 9 p.m. Harlem time, the telephone rang in the apartment where Mamie sat with the others. She snatched it up. "Hello." "A collect call from California," came the operator's voice. Mamie accepted the charges, her heart pounding. After a series of clicks, she heard the familiar deep baritone. "This is Ellsworth." Only Mamie and Pettigrew knew it was Bumpy on the line. The others fell silent, holding their breaths. In terse, coded language, mindful, that a guard likely sat nearby listening, Mamie explained what had happened. "Mama's out of her home," she said, voice shaking with anger. The landlord put her on the street. "Yes, she's okay now, we have her here with us. But that man, Greenfield, he came himself with police." On the other end in Alcatraz's administrative office, Bumpy Johnson went quiet. Mamie could hear only a slow intake of breath. To those who knew him, that silence was more ominous than any curse or shout. Bumpy was not a man who often raised his voice. When enraged, he tended to get softer, more precise. Finally, he spoke. "Nat there." Mamie handed the receiver to Pettigrew. Pettigrew identified himself for the benefit of any listening ears. Then he said, "We got Mama taken care of. She's safe with us." He paused, then added, "We will take care of everything else, boss. You have my word." There was a beat of silence. Then Bumpy's measured response crackled over the line from 3,000 miles away. "I know you will, Pep. But listen." The men in the room leaned in. Bumpy's voice remained calm, but each word was picked carefully, like bullets loaded into a chamber. "Make sure," he said, "that landlord understands. He evicted my mother, so now I'm evicting him. Permanently." Pettigrew's jaw tightened. "Understood?" The call ended with Bumpy asking to speak to Willie May. Briefly, he used a gentle tone to reassure the shaken woman that he loved her and that she'd be back in her home soon. And then a final instruction to alls. "Take care of Mama, and do what needs doing." The line went dead. Everyone in the kitchen exhaled at once. The order had been given. What happened over the next 48 hours has entered the realm of Harlem legend. The exact details are known only through whispered accounts, pieced together from those who claim to have been there. No official police report would ever tell the full story, but the streets of Harlem would talk about it for years. According to one oft-repeated account, Nat Pettigrew mobilized a small crew of Bumpy's most trusted enforcers on the very next night, January 12, 1955. They chose that date because they knew Samuel Greenfield, the landlord, always came to Harlem on Wednesdays to collect rent receipts from his managers. Greenfield had an office in downtown Manhattan, but he would drive uptown in his shiny black Oldsmobile once a week, thinking himself brave for venturing into what he privately called the jungle. He never went alone, of course. He typically brought along a hired goon or off-duty cop as muscle. But on this night, Greenfield would find that no amount of hired muscle could save him from Bumpy's shadow. Shortly after 10 p.m., as the last of Harlem's shopkeepers pulled down their metal grates for the night, Samuel Greenfield emerged from one of his properties on 148th Street. He had spent the evening going over rent ledgers in the basement office. His bodyguard, a hulking figure in a trench coat, followed close behind, scanning the quiet street. Pettigrew and two of Bumpy's men were waiting in a car nearby, engine idling. It was a cold, moonless night, the sidewalks nearly empty. The men in the car watched as Greenfield, a pudgy man of 50 with a pencil, thin mustache, fumbled for his car keys. Pettigrew stepped out of the vehicle and approached with a casual stride, hands in the pockets of his long coat. As he drew near, the bodyguard noticed him and tensed. "Evening, gentlemen?" Pettigrew said, almost cheerful. Greenfield barely glanced at him, just another Harlem face. But then Pettigrew uttered a single word that froze the landlord in his tracks. "Eviction's a bitch, ain't it?" Before Greenfield could react, Pettigrew nodded. In a flash, two more men materialized from the shadows behind Greenfield and his guard. One pressed the cold barrel of a revolver to the bodyguard's temple. "Don't even blink," he hissed. The other seized Greenfield by the collar. Greenfield's eyes went wide. "What is this?" he sputtered. "Do you know who I am?" Pettigrew stepped closer, so that Greenfield could see his face clearly under the dim street lamp. "Yeah, I know exactly who you are, Mr. Greenfield. You're the piece of garbage that put Ellsworth Johnson's mother out on the street yesterday." At the mention of Bumpy's name, All color drained from Greenfield's cheeks. He had been in Harlem long enough to know that name and to know he had made a grave mistake. I was just... He stammered, sweat now beading on his brow despite the chill. It was legal. She didn't pay. I had the right. He never finished the sentence. The two men grabbed him, one on each arm, and Frog marched the struggling landlord toward his own building's entrance. The bodyguard, disarmed and held at gunpoint, was ordered to lie face down on the sidewalk and count to 100 if he wanted to live. He complied, too terrified to do otherwise. According to later whispers, a few residents of the building peeked through their peepholes or cracked, open doors as the men dragged Greenfield up flight after flight of stairs. If they saw anything, they said nothing. In Harlem, the code of silence, when it came to Bumpy Johnson, was ironclad. People either loved him or feared him. But either way, they didn't snitch. Up the narrow stairs they went, Greenfield's leather soles scrabbling and scuffing as he tried to resist. He was wheezing from exertion and terror by the time they reached the top floor, the roof access door, which Pettigrew kicked open. A bitter wind howled across the rooftop. From this height, 7 stories above the street, Harlem spread out in a sea of flickering lights and hulking tenements. Off in the distance, the George Washington Bridge's lights twinkled. Greenfield had no eye for the view now. He was begging for his life. Please, let's be reasonable. I can pay money. You want money. I have 200 in my wallet right now. Take it. Pettigrew responded by slapping the wallet out of the landlord's hand, sending bills fluttering off the roof into the dark. You think money will fix this? He snarled. You insulted the Johnson family. You put a 73-year-old woman out in the cold. Did you think there'd be no consequences? Greenfield's back hit the low parapet wall at the roof's edge as the men advanced. He looked over his shoulder and saw the sheer drop to the street. A wave of nausea rolled through him. What happened next remains the subject of hushed conversation. One Harlem resident who lived across the street would later swear he heard a gunshot and then a scream that night. Others claim there was no gunshot, that the only sound was Greenfield's blubbering pleas suddenly rising to a shriek and then cutting off. What is generally agreed is that Samuel Greenfield went off the roof. Whether he was pushed or made to jump at gunpoint is unclear, but the result was the same. He fell 7 stories, cartwheeling through the icy air, and crashed onto the hood of a parked car with a sickening crunch. By the time pedestrians ran toward the scene, Greenfield's broken body lay half on the car, half rolled onto the asphalt, eyes staring lifelessly at the sky. The screams of a passerby rent the night, drawing more people and soon the police. In the chaos that ensued, Pettigrew and his men slipped away into alley shadows, ghosts returning to the ether. Not a single witness on the street could tell the arriving officers exactly what had happened. A few shrugged and said they heard a noise, looked up, and saw a man falling. Perhaps he jumped. Some speculated perhaps it was an accident. The uniformed cops, peering up at the roofline and then down at the crumpled form of the landlord, were skeptical. One older black man in a bathrobe spoke up, his voice dripping with a mix of sarcasm and satisfaction. Might just be that gravity evicted him. The cops shot him a hard look, but the crowd murmured in agreement. They all knew, but none would say this was street justice, the kind that visited you when you wronged the wrong person. The police investigation into Greenfield's death went nowhere. Officially, the incident was recorded as an accidental death, the initial theory being that the landlord slipped while inspecting something on the roof. Unofficially, detectives on the case quickly learned of the eviction that preceded the fall. One detective, an Irish-American who had worked Harlem's 28th precinct for years, heard rumors linking the death to the Johnson crew. In the back rooms of the precinct house, he confided to a colleague, "This has Bumpy written all over it." But with Bumpy in a federal prison and none of his known associates caught at the scene, there was little NYPD could do. The few Greenfield building tenants who were questioned by police shrugged and claimed they'd been asleep or out at the time. The landlord's bodyguard, who survived with a concussion, one of Bumpy's men, had knocked him out cold on the sidewalk to ensure he stayed put, told a sketchy story of being jumped by unidentified Negro assailants. He didn't see faces, he insisted, a convenient lapse that may have been motivated by fear. For all his supposed bravado, that bodyguard knew that identifying Bumpy's crew could sign his own death warrant. In the end, the coroner's inquiry returned an open verdict. No charges were filed. Case closed. But in the court of Harlem's opinion, the case was anything but closed. Greenfield's violent end was the talk of the community, and with each retelling the story grew more legendary. People spoke of how Bumpy Johnson had reached out from behind the walls of Alcatraz and exacted vengeance on behalf of his mother. It didn't matter that Bumpy wasn't physically there. In fact, that detail made the story even more astonishing. How powerful must a man be to orchestrate such an act from a prison cell on the Rock? According to neighborhood lore, Bumpy placed one phone call, and 24 hours later the landlord was dead, a swift and clinical punishment that left everyone awestruck. And unlike many street tales that get embellished beyond truth, this one had some very real proof in the form of Greenfield's obituary. The Amsterdam News ran a short piece noting that real estate owner Samuel Greenfield, 50, died in a fall under mysterious circumstances. And community members read between the lines. In the days following, Bumpy's name was on everyone's lips, from the corner bodegas to the church pulpits, where some pastors denounced the vigilante justice, even as their flocks quietly approved. In one barbershop on the 135th Street, a customer was overheard quipping, "Throwing a man off a roof. That's one hell of a rent refund." The barber, who had known Bumpy in his younger days, simply nodded and said, "Mistray. Johnson don't play when it come to his family." Many in Harlem felt a grim satisfaction. Slumlords had abused them for so long with impunity that to see one of those landlords literally fall felt like cosmic justice. Tenant organizers, who had been fighting in courts and protests for better housing, suddenly found more people willing to attend meetings. After all, if Bumpy's act didn't scare other landlords into treating tenants better, nothing would. There was even a noticeable, if unspoken, change among some Harlem landlords in the ensuing weeks. Maintenance requests that had long been ignored were mysteriously addressed, and the most abusive superintendents on a few blocks were quietly replaced. It seemed no landlord wanted to be the next Greenfield. Of course, not everyone celebrated. The city's power brokers and law enforcement saw Bumpy's hidden hand in the landlord's demise, and it unsettled them. At the FBI field office in New York, an internal memo from early 1955 noted that informants report Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's continued influence over Harlem criminal elements despite incarceration, citing the recent incident with a landlord as evidence, although the memo coyly referred to it as the Edgecombe Avenue matter. For the NYPD, this was a humiliation, a reminder that in some quarters of the city, the word of an imprisoned black gangster held more sway than that of the police. But lacking evidence, officials could only tighten surveillance. They quietly leaned on a few of Bumpy's known associates, hoping someone would crack. None did. Harlem closed ranks. Even Greenfield's fellow landlords, despite their outrage, didn't dare publicly connect the dots. One Harlem property owner was overheard grumbling to another at a downtown cafe. "That damned Bumpy Johnson, even in jail he's running things up there." The other man replied in a hushed tone, "Keep your voice down. You want to end up on a sidewalk." Meanwhile, in Alcatraz, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson continued his daily routine as inmate Fay Levin 17. Outwardly, nothing had changed. He swept the prison corridors as assigned, played chess on the recreation yard with the quiet intensity he was known for, and offered polite, "yes, sir," to guards. But those who knew him, fellow prisoners, like a young man named Henry, who often sat with Bumpy at meals, noticed a certain contentment in his demeanor after the January news from Harlem. Bumpy got a letter from home one day and read it real slow, Henry would later recall. Then he folded it up, closed his eyes like he was saying a prayer, and smiled to himself. That was a rare sight, Bumpy smiling. It's not hard to guess what that letter probably contained confirmation that Mama Willie May was safely back in her apartment, and that the situation with the landlord has been resolved. Indeed, within a week of Greenfield's death, a new property manager arrived at 409 Edgecombe Avenue. He was a black gentleman from downtown notably more courteous to the tenants, and one of his first acts was to apologize to Mrs. Johnson for the misunderstanding and invite her to move back into her apartment, expenses paid for the trouble caused. Willie May, with gentle stubbornness, insisted on sweeping up the dust in her own apartment herself before moving her things back in, determined to restore her home with her own hands. The community watched this reversal with knowing smiles clearly. Whoever now controlled Greenfield's estate had no intention of crossing Bumpy's family again. The incident of the landlord and the rooftop eviction became part of Bumpy Johnson's growing mythos. In pool halls and tenement courtyards, they recounted it like a modern David and Goliath tale. A white landlord thought he could bully a black grandmother. The story went, and Harlem's own David Bumpy struck him down without even being there. It joined the other stories circulating about Bumpy during his imprisonment, stories that cast him as a sort of avenging angel for Black Harlem. There was the story, also whispered and unconfirmed, that in 1959 Bumpy had maimed a racist prisoner in Alcatraz who insulted a black inmate, slashing the man's face with a blade. That tale was already making the rounds in 1955, slightly ahead of its actual occurrence, a testament to how Bumpy's legend could transcend time and facts. Whether in prison or in Harlem, Bumpy's persona was coalescing into that of a folk hero, a man who might have been a criminal by law, but who many believed dealt out true justice when the system failed black people. The legal and political aftermath of the Greenfield incident was subtle but notable. In Harlem's local politics, some pointed to the landlord's death as a sign of deepening desperation in the community. Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., Harlem's fiery congressman, made an oblique reference in a sermon turned speech at Abyssinian Baptist Church a few weeks later. When people are pushed to the brink, Powell intoned to his congregation, they will take matters into their own hands. Let that be a warning to those who exploit the poor and the elderly. The parishioners knew what he was talking about, even if Powell didn't name names. On the legal front, tenant advocates like Jesse Gray of the Harlem Tenants Council seized the moment to push harder for reform. Gray had been organizing rent strikes and demanding stronger rent control and eviction protections. He privately remarked to an ally that, nothing moves City Hall faster than fear, and you can bet those downtown bosses are afraid Harlem will have a dozen more Bumpies if things don't change. There was some truth to that. City officials did quietly expedite discussions on strengthening tenant protections in Harlem and increasing funding for housing code enforcement, not out of pure altruism, but because they worried about unrest. As one blunt housing official put it, we don't want tenants concluding that the only way to get justice is through gangsters. For the family directly involved, Bumpy's family, the event was both traumatic and affirming. Mamie Johnson visited her husband in Alcatraz later that year and would recall how he squeezed her hand a little tighter when she told him how Mama is doing fine now, back home. And the landlord problem is taken care of. Bumpy had simply nodded. He did not ask for details, he didn't need to. He trusted Pettigrew and the others implicitly, but Mamie saw the relief in his eyes. For all his underworld power, Bumpy had been helpless in that moment when his mother figure was in danger, reliant on others to defend her. Knowing that his family had closed ranks and upheld his code of honor clearly gave him a measure of peace. Willie May herself, though shaken by the ordeal, recovered her spirits. She would go on to live several more years, doted on by the community and protected quietly by Bumpy's network. Every Thanksgiving and Christmas, even while Bumpy remained in prison, Willie May's pantry and table overflowed with food baskets, gifts, and envelopes of cash from anonymous friends. Everyone knew the source Bumpy never failed to provide, even when physically absent. As 1955 turned to 1956 and onward, the ripple effects of the rooftop incident continued. Harlem had always had its share of crime and shadow justice, but now a curious sense of balance settled in. Slumlords grew a tad more cautious. Those who were the worst abusers either cleaned up their act or quietly sold off their Harlem holdings and retreated to safer investments elsewhere. Tenants, for their part, felt a renewed boldness to complain and organize after all, They'd seen an extreme example of what could happen if landlords pushed too far. It would be an exaggeration to credit Bumpy's vengeance with single-handedly improving Harlem housing. The structural problems were far too vast, but on the micro level of day-to-day life, there was a palpable lessening of the fear that tenants had felt. They had seen that even a powerful landlord could be held accountable one way or another. For Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, the legend of his mother's eviction and the landlord's fate became an integral part of his reputation upon returning to New York. When Bumpy was paroled in 1963 after serving 10 years, Harlem welcomed him back with an impromptu parade, complete with cheering crowds and a marching band. Old-timers say that one of the loudest ovations during that parade came when someone shouted from an apartment window, "Thank you for taking care of that landlord, Bumpy," a remark that caused Bumpy to tip his hat with a slight smile as the crowd roared. Despite his criminal record, he was beloved in Harlem for the very sort of story that played out in 1955. The people knew what he had done, or at least firmly believed they knew, and they admired him for it. To them, Bumpy Johnson had proven once again that he would go to any lengths to defend the dignity of Harlem's black residents, whether from violent racist inmates in a far-off prison or from greedy racist landlords right at home. In the years that followed, Bumpy managed to maintain his Robin Hood image even as he resumed some illicit activities. He notably staged a one-man protest in 1965 by sitting in a police station and refusing to leave until the police stopped harassing his neighborhood, an episode that only burnished his standing as a community champion. But among all the tales swapped on street corners and front stoops, the story of the landlord and the roof remained one of the most striking. Parents would recount it to wayward sons as a lesson about protecting family and community. Community organizers referenced it, half-jokingly, when landlords were slow to make repairs. "Don't make us call Bumpy," they'd say, prompting nervous chuckles. And in the prisons, from Rikers Island to Leavenworth, the legend circulated too, often merged with the Alcatraz stabbing story Bumpy Johnson, the inmate who could still send someone flying off a roof back home if you crossed him. It elevated him to near mythic status among black inmates especially, who took pride in a figure who commanded such respect and fear. Of course, Bumpy Johnson was not invincible or immortal. He ultimately died of a heart attack in 1968, collapsing in a Harlem restaurant at age 62, a quiet end that belied the epic life he had led. But even in death, his legend only grew. At his funeral, it said, thousands lined the streets. Among the floral arrangements was one in the shape of an open door, sent anonymously. Some speculate it was from grateful tenants, an homage to how Bumpy had opened the door for Willie May to return home, and symbolically for Harlem's oppressed to reclaim dignity. Others believe it might have been a dark nod to the door Greenfield was taken through to the roof. Either way, the symbolism spoke volumes. Bumpy Johnson was remembered as the man who kicked down doors and pushed out those who needed pushing. The 1955 eviction incident, stripped of its sensational retellings, stands as a revealing chapter in the social history of 1950s Harlem. It laid bare the harsh realities of housing discrimination and black tenant abuse, showing how a community under extreme pressure found solace and justice not in the institutions of law and governance, but in one of its own, a man who operated outside the law. It highlighted the failure of the system to protect people like Willie May Johnson and how that vacuum of justice was filled by the likes of Bumpy. The racial and political context of the time made such an outcome almost inevitable. Harlem's black residents had long been denied equal protection, whether it was in housing, policing, or economic opportunity, so they created their own systems of survival and retribution. Bumpy Johnson, with his intellect, charisma, and capacity for strategic violence, became a key figure in that parallel system. In the end, the story resonates on multiple levels. For the people of Harlem, it was a tale of family and community. A son could not physically be there to defend his mother, so the community, through his will, defended her in his stead. For those who study power dynamics, it's an example of how even marginalized communities will find champions to stand up to injustice by any means necessary. For law enforcement and city officials of the era, It was a cautionary tale: neglect and abuse people for too long, and they may celebrate when a gangster administers the punishment you won't. And for storytellers, it is simply dramatic and poignant: an elderly woman on a winter street, a grievous wrong committed, and an underworld avenger delivering poetic justice from afar. As a continuous narration passed down, the 1955 landlord eviction affairs, as some later dubbed it in books and articles, retains a kind of stark educational value. It teaches us about the reality of segregation in housing, that in 1950s New York, a black woman like Willie May could be tossed out of her home for demanding basic decency, and no city agency would help her. It underscores the complexity of figures like Bumpy Johnson, who was at once a criminal and a folk hero. It situates itself firmly in the social, racial, and political context of its time: a segregated city, a neglected black community, and the emergence of informal black power structures to fill the void. And importantly, it reminds us that behind the legends and the nicknames were real people: a devoted son, a frightened mother, neighbors who cared, and a community that, when pushed to the brink, found an unlikely savior in a man like Bumpy. In Harlem's collective memory, the day Bumpy Johnson, evicted. A heartless landlord from the roof stands as a moment when justice, however rough, was served. They say that after 1955, no Harlem landlord ever again dared harm Bumpy's kin or exploit Harlem's people so brazenly. Whether that's strictly true or not, it captures the feeling that spread in the aftermath. Don't ever think that because the people of Harlem are downtrodden, they are defenseless. They have their champions, even if those champions wear fedoras and carry switchblades instead of badges. And if you wrong them gravely enough, you might just find yourself learning far too late that you should never, ever disrespect Bumpy Johnson or those he loves. In the lore of Harlem, the 1955 rooftop eviction story endures as both cautionary tale and source of dark pride. It is recounted not to glorify violence, but to underline a bitter truth of that era, when ordinary avenues of justice were denied to black people, extraordinary and sometimes violent measures filled the void. And so it was that in 1955, a landlord's merciless act of eviction was answered by an equally merciless act of retribution. Harlem's message to the world was unmistakable. Touch our mothers and grandmothers, abuse our community's trust, and you may pay the ultimate price. It was a message written in broken glass and blood, delivered from a rooftop, and echoed in the streets. Harlem may have been oppressed, but it was never powerless. And as long as men like Bumpy Johnson drew breath, Harlem was never truly without protection or vengeance when needed.